He thought he was stealing from me in secret. He thought the money was vanishing into places I would never find, into accounts buried behind shell companies, coded invoices, and quiet little digital tunnels only he understood. He thought I was still the woman sitting across from him every Monday morning, nodding over growth projections, trusting the numbers he handed me, believing the polished version of the story he had been feeding me for years. He thought wrong. Because by the time he moved the final million, the bank he trusted most was already mine. And I watched every cent. I watched him build his own trap one transfer at a time. I watched him smile while he did it. And I let him. I know that sounds cold. I know some people will hear that and say I should have confronted him immediately, should have screamed, should have called the police the first night I saw something wrong, should have dragged the truth into daylight before it had time to grow teeth. But betrayal does something strange to you. It does not always make you loud. Sometimes it makes you still. Sometimes it makes you so quiet that the people around you mistake that silence for ignorance. That was his second mistake. The first was stealing from me. The second was assuming I did not know how to wait. I remember the exact moment the whole thing cracked open. It was 3:12 in the morning. I know the time because I looked at the clock twice, then again, then one more time as if the minute itself would change what I was seeing on my laptop. The house was silent. The city outside my window had that dark, suspended feeling it gets before dawn, when everything honest is asleep and everything dishonest feels bolder. I had opened one of our quarterly cash flow reports because something had been bothering me all week. It was not one dramatic thing. It was not an obvious red flag. It was a feeling. A small drag in my chest every time I looked at one line item in our overseas marketing spend. The numbers matched on the surface. That was what made it dangerous. They were neat, balanced, reconciled, almost elegant. But they were too elegant, too frictionless. Real business is messy. Expansion is messy. International vendor relationships are messy. There are delays, mismatched references, duplicate communications, irritated follow-ups, revised quotes, human error. Our reports had all of that everywhere else. But that section? Clean, smooth, controlled, too controlled. So I clicked deeper, then into the attached payment authorizations. And that was when I saw a company name I did not recognize. That alone should not have meant much. We had dozens of vendors across markets. But something about the naming structure bothered me. It felt assembled rather than born. Like it had been designed to sound legitimate to people who were too busy to question it. I pulled up the entity registration documents, then the invoice trail, then the routing details on the wire instructions. By the second hour, my stomach had gone cold. By the third, I had stopped hoping I was wrong. Because the company was real enough to pass a lazy check, but shallow enough to collapse under a serious one. No meaningful online footprint. A registration history that led through 2 jurisdictions known for opacity. A phone number that rang through to a generic business answering system. And the authorized signatory listed on one of the internal payment approvals had initials I knew far too well. His. Not typed in full. Just initialed in the quick, confident way people sign things when they are sure nobody will ever study the page. I stared at the screen so long my eyes started to burn. I wish I could tell you I cried right then. That would make emotional sense. It would make the story easier to understand. But I did not cry. I did not rage. I did not knock over a glass or call his number or wake up the whole world with the truth. I just sat there, my hand resting near the trackpad, my back stiff, my mouth dry, trying to understand how a person can work beside you for years, eat at your table, call you family in front of investors, laugh with you over bad coffee and late flights and impossible deadlines, and still be building a second life underneath your trust. I was not just looking at theft. I was looking at performance. At a lie so practiced it had become part of our company's architecture. And that was the part that hurt most. Not the money. Not yet. It was the humiliation of realizing that someone had been using my own faith in him as a business asset. Some wounds change you. Some betrayals break you, and some people quietly, deliberately rise. This is a quiet storm story. When we started the company, everyone told me I was lucky to have him. That was the narrative. He was sharp, polished, easy in rooms that made other people sweat. He could walk into a meeting with people who had already decided to dismiss us and somehow leave with a second meeting on the calendar. He understood leverage. He understood timing. He understood how to make powerful people feel like they were discovering their own good ideas while he subtly placed those ideas in front of them. And I understood everything else. I understood structure, systems, discipline, compliance, the real internal bones that stop a fast-growing company from becoming a beautiful disaster. I knew how to build things that could survive pressure. I knew how to see 3/4 ahead. I knew how to hear what people were not saying in due diligence calls. I knew when our team was stretched too thin even before they admitted it. I knew what had to be strengthened before the outside world noticed the weakness. He used to joke that I was the spine and he was the smile. People laughed when he said it. I did too. Back then it sounded affectionate. Later, I realized it was a confession. The company grew faster than anyone expected. What began as a bold little partnership became something with real weight. Offices in 3 cities. International contracts. Industry coverage. Invitations into rooms where people spoke in low voices and moved life-changing sums with a signature. The kind of growth that makes outsiders congratulate you and insiders start calculating. I had built my whole career on one belief, that if you were smart enough, disciplined enough, and careful enough about who you let close, you could build something clean. Not perfect, but clean. Hard-earned. Defensible. Mine. That belief died at 3:12 in the morning. By sunrise, I had already made one decision. I would not confront him. Not yet. There are moments in life where emotion begs for immediate action because action feels like dignity. It feels like strength. It feels like the only way to keep yourself from looking weak. But business has taught me something more useful than pride. Timing matters more than expression. The first person to speak in a crisis is not always the strongest. Often they are just the one who cannot tolerate uncertainty. I could tolerate it. Barely. But enough. So at 8:30 that morning I went into the office dressed the same way I always did, carrying the same leather folder, with my face arranged into the same composed version of myself the world was used to seeing. I walked past reception. I greeted the team. I stepped into the executive conference room. And 8 minutes later, he walked in with 2 coffees and one of those easy smiles that used to make everyone feel like the room had relaxed. Long night, he asked when he looked at me. For one dangerous second, I wondered if he knew. Not because of guilt. People like him rarely leak guilt that early. But because deception makes you paranoid. Once you know what someone is capable of, every ordinary word sounds layered. Every glance feels intentional. I took the coffee from his hand, looked directly at him, and said, "Quarter close always does that." He laughed softly, sat down, opened his laptop, began talking through our pipeline as if he had not spent the last year draining money through structures designed to make me look the wrong way. That was the morning I learned a second truth. A liar does not always look nervous when they are winning. Sometimes they look radiant. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a version of myself I had never needed before. I watched. I listened. I asked better questions, but fewer of them. I stopped reacting from the surface and started tracing patterns underneath it. Once you stop assuming innocence, people reveal themselves quickly. Not because they change, but because your interpretation does. Little things I might once have excused became obvious. His eagerness to approve specific vendors personally. His habit of redirecting financial reviews toward revenue wins and away from operational detail. His sudden insistence that certain international relationships were too culturally delicate for broader internal scrutiny. His slight irritation, almost invisible to anyone else, whenever I requested source documentation instead of summary slides. He had not just created a scheme. He had created a story around the scheme. One in which he was the globally savvy strategist, protecting the company's growth from bureaucracy. One in which my caution could be framed as admirable but old-fashioned. One in which the very controls I built could be sidestepped because he presented the sidestep as speed. The first full map took me 18 days. I did not use our internal analysts. I did not trust the digital trail inside our own office until I knew how much access he had, and I knew enough by then to assume it was more than I wanted. I worked at night through an external forensic team introduced quietly by an attorney who owed me a favor and knew better than to ask for the whole story. We built everything outside our usual reporting channels. Clean room. Restricted devices. Separate document servers. No names on files. Only codes. The pattern was uglier than I imagined. The money moved in layers. It left the company in respectable-looking portions, dressed as campaign spend, consultant retainers, regional market entry expenses. From there it hit holding entities that existed just long enough to receive, divide, and redirect. Then it moved again into a small commercial bank that specialized in cross-border business clients, private wealth structures, and discrete high-value relationships. From there it branched into private accounts under entities that looked legally unrelated until you followed the beneficial ownership signatures. At the center of almost all of it was him. Not always directly. Never stupidly. But unmistakably. The total by the end of the first internal reconstruction was 11.4 million. I remember saying the number out loud in the empty room just to hear whether it sounded as impossible as it felt. It did. It also sounded personal. Because here is what people do not understand about embezzlement at that level. It is not just theft from the business as some abstract machine. A business is not abstract when you built it. It is years of your life in a structure. It is deferred sleep, missed dinners, stress under your ribs, employees you hired and promised stability to, risks you took with your name attached, reputation converted into payroll for other families. Every stolen dollar had not come from nowhere. It had come from a life I had spent building. And still, I said nothing. Not because I was passive. Because I was calculating scale. There was a threshold I needed him to cross. Not morally. He had crossed that already. Legally. Strategically. Irreversibly. A messy accusation is one thing. An airtight handoff is another. I did not want headlines built around allegations. I wanted a file so complete that even his own reflection would have had to admit what he did. So I waited. That was the period that changed me most. You learn a lot about yourself when you have to sit across from betrayal and act like you do not recognize it. You learn where your self-control lies. You learn how steady your voice can stay while something ugly beats against your ribs. You learn how many versions of anger exist. There is hot anger, which burns fast and often makes a scene. Then there is cold anger, which becomes discipline. Cold anger can work 8-hour meetings. Cold anger can sign documents with a calm hand. Cold anger can ask, "Can you walk me through the assumptions behind this transfer schedule?" in a tone so neutral the other person smiles while answering. He smiled often. Sometimes I wondered whether some part of him wanted to be caught. Not because he had a conscience, but because deception at that scale creates its own intoxication. He had begun to move with the looseness of a man who believed he had outplayed not just me, but structure itself. He interrupted more. Corrected me in meetings with that polished, patronizing softness men use when they want to appear collaborative while taking territory. Started talking about legacy. About what came next. About possibly stepping back from day-to-day leadership after one final expansion cycle. One final expansion cycle. That phrase sat in me like metal. He was preparing an exit. And then I found the bank. Or rather, I understood the bank. At first it looked like a transit point. Just another institution in the laundering route. But the more we traced movement, the more obvious it became that it was not incidental. It was central. He trusted it. Too much. He had relationships there. Private support. Special handling. Quiet accommodation. Transactions that would have raised questions elsewhere moved through with unusually little friction. The bank was not simply where he hid money. It was where he felt safest. That was when the idea came. Not all at once. Not like lightning. More like a door inside my mind opening slowly. What if I did not just follow the money? What if I owned the place he believed protected him? The bank was not a giant public institution. It was smaller, specialized, well-connected in the kinds of networks that matter more than size. Profitable on paper, though not exceptionally. Conservative externally, but vulnerable in ways only someone studying closely would notice. A pending capital challenge. A governance transition. Two shareholders quietly looking to reduce exposure. A chairperson nearing retirement and more concerned with stability than spectacle. It was possible. Extremely difficult, but possible. I moved everything through proxies, attorneys, and private capital. No public noise. No announcement. No loose conversation. No visible link back to me until the controlling position was already secured and the governance shift was effectively irreversible. Even then, the structure was layered enough that most outside observers would not have recognized the significance until it was too late. The acquisition took 11 weeks. The longest 11 weeks of my life. During the day, I ran a company beside the man stealing from it. At night, I negotiated for the institution helping him do it. There was one evening, maybe halfway through, when I sat alone in my car in the underground parking garage after everyone had gone home. My forehead was resting against the steering wheel. The fluorescent lights above the concrete pillars made everything feel drained and unreal. I had not eaten a real meal in 2 days. My lawyer had just warned me that one small leak in the acquisition process could collapse the whole strategy and force everything into public view before I was ready. My forensic team had flagged another set of suspicious transfers. And for the first time since 3:12 that morning, I genuinely thought about stopping. Not because I forgave him. Because I was tired. Tired in the bone-deep way that makes quitting look almost holy. I remember thinking, I could end this tonight. I could call him. I could put the evidence on the table. I could blow up the partnership, salvage what I can, and walk away from this insane plan before it consumes the rest of me. That was the closest I came to giving up. But then another thought arrived, quiet and sharp. If I stop now, he learns fear. If I continue, he learns consequence. And those are not the same lesson. So I lifted my head, wiped my face, and kept going. When the bank finally became mine, I did not celebrate. There was no champagne. No exhale. No triumphant music swelling in the background like movies promise when a plan comes together. There was just access. Secure credentials. Governance control. Visibility. The first time I logged into the back-end oversight systems from the position of ownership, I felt something I still struggle to describe. Not joy. Not relief. Something colder and more exacting than that. Like the emotional chaos of the past 3 months had suddenly entered a room where everything had edges again. There they were. The accounts. The entities. The relationships. The routing preferences. The special service notes. His hidden world, flattened into ledgers and flags and administrative history. It is strange how small evil looks when converted into data. All that arrogance reduced to timestamps. All that deception reduced to account structures and authorization chains. I had expected to feel vindicated. Instead, I felt almost sad. Not for him. For the intimacy of what he had done. To betray someone in business is one thing. To do it through systems they built beside you, while looking them in the eye, while accepting their trust as operating capital, while letting them continue believing in a shared future, that is something more hollow. That is not greed alone. That is appetite without boundary. From that point on, the game changed. He still believed he was moving freely. In reality, every key interaction on the relevant accounts now sat under enhanced internal monitoring. Every significant transaction touched layers of review he did not know existed. My private security and forensic team coordinated with a restricted compliance unit inside the bank that answered directly upward through my authority. We did not interfere yet. We watched, logged, preserved. built chronology, confirmed beneficial ownership linkages, strengthened the record. And because I now understood his confidence source, I could read him better. He grew almost cheerful. That was the horrifying part. The closer he got to what he thought was escape, the lighter he seemed in the office. He started arriving late with the ease of someone already emotionally detached. Started taking more private calls in glass conference rooms. Started floating strategic ideas that would have buried irregularities beneath a major corporate transaction. The boldest was a proposed merger structure that, if approved, would have created enough complexity and movement to make retrospective tracing much harder for anyone starting from scratch. He presented that plan in one of the most surreal board meetings of my life. There he was at the front of the room, elegant and composed, talking about synergies, timing, shareholder value, strategic realignment. His slides were beautiful. His language was precise. He sounded like a man steering the company toward its next era. And maybe that was the moment I truly understood him. He did not experience himself as a villain. People like him almost never do. In his mind, he had probably turned this whole thing into a story about entitlement, compensation, genius unrecognized, risks he deserved to privately capitalize on. Maybe he believed he had built more of the company than I had. Maybe he believed he was just taking what a lesser mind would have wasted. Maybe he believed being clever enough to hide theft made the theft almost legitimate. That is the narcotic of unchecked ego. It does not just excuse behavior. It edits reality. I let him finish the presentation. I asked 2 measured questions. I told the board we needed more analysis before moving forward. And after the meeting, while everyone else drifted out in small groups, he stayed behind just long enough to give me a look that once would have felt companionable and now felt theatrical. "You look exhausted," he said. I held his gaze and answered, "Big transitions require energy." He smiled. "So they do. There are some moments that feel like 2 people speaking in different languages while pretending not to notice." That was one of them. By then, federal coordination had already begun. Quietly, carefully, through counsel, regulators, and financial crime channels that do not move quickly until they do. Once the record reached the point where intervention made sense, we synchronized everything. Asset freezes, suspicious activity protocols, preservation orders, authentication of internal logs, cross-jurisdictional requests queued for execution. Nobody dramatic. Nobody kicking down doors. Real power often looks administrative until the door closes. The final transfer attempt came on a Thursday morning. I know because Thursdays used to be our standing review days. For years we met at 10, compared operational updates, and aligned before the wider executive sessions began. By then that ritual had become almost unbearable, a little museum of our old working relationship preserved long after it had rotted. That morning he was especially polished. Navy suit, white shirt, silver watch. The version of himself he wore when he wanted to project control without ostentation. He was relaxed. More than relaxed. He was bright around the edges, energized in a way that made me certain something significant was about to happen. At 9:47, the monitoring team alerted us that an unusual transfer sequence had initiated through one of the main concealed structures. Large, coordinated, designed to consolidate and move. Not a test. Not maintenance. The move. His move. The amount was just over 3 million in that sequence alone, though in context it was meant to unlock much more. I was in my office looking at the secure screen when the first authorization entered queue. There is a myth that revenge feels hot and thrilling when it arrives. It did not. I felt incredibly calm. Calm in the way water looks calm when depth makes its own gravity. I watched the entries populate. Watched the verification behavior. Watched him use pathways he had trusted for months, maybe years. And then, precisely where we had prepared for it, the sequence encountered controlled friction. Not enough to spook him immediately. Just enough to hold. Delay. Reroute into mandatory review. Secondary checks. Then a hard internal stop. He tried again through another path. Held. Again. Held. By 10:12 he had left his office and made the first call to the bank. By 10:19 he was angry. By 10:31 he requested an urgent private meeting with senior banking leadership. The appointment was given for noon. He had no idea I was the one who approved it. The hours between 10:31 and noon felt unreal. We still had staff moving around outside as if it were an ordinary day. Assistants scheduling things. Analysts carrying binders. Someone laughing at the far end of the corridor. I sat through 2 regular conversations and signed 4 standard documents while waiting for the most important confrontation of my professional life. The world can be obscenely normal right beside a collapse. A little before 11, he came to my door. He did not look panicked yet. Irritated, yes. Controlled, yes. But not afraid. He still believed this was a systems problem, an error, a delay he could push through with status and urgency. "Do you have 5 minutes?" he asked. I looked up from a page I was not really reading. "Of course." He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and began with the sort of controlled annoyance wealthy men often reserve for institutions they think exist to serve them. "I'm dealing with a ridiculous issue at the bank," he said. "They've frozen a transfer that should never have been flagged. It's part of a private arrangement connected to one of the offshore structures." He said it smoothly. Too smoothly. That was the moment I knew just how convinced he was of my ignorance. He was comfortable enough to tell the truth inside a lie, betting I lacked the framework to interpret it. I tilted my head slightly. "That sounds inconvenient." Inconvenient is one word for it. I let a second pass. "Do you need anything from me?" He studied my face, maybe measuring whether I looked curious. Maybe checking whether my exhaustion had made me less perceptive than usual. Then he shook his head. "No. I'll handle it." I nodded once. "I'm sure you will." He left. At 11:56, he entered the bank's executive suite. He was escorted not to the usual relationship office he expected, but to the main boardroom on the upper level. That unsettled him. I know because I watched him on the internal security feed before I joined the room. He slowed slightly at the door. His expression changed almost invisibly, not yet to fear, but to confusion. People notice room changes before they notice fate. Inside, the screen was already live. No theatrics. No dramatic lighting. Just a large, clear display showing the consolidated transaction map, the flagged transfer attempts, the linked accounts, and the total amount under review. I entered from the side door 3 seconds after he did. He turned. And for the first time since 3:12 in the morning all those months ago, I saw his composure crack. Not explode. Crack. There is a difference. Explosion is messy and public. A crack is more intimate. It is the tiny visible failure of a structure under weight. At first, he looked almost offended, as if my presence in that room was an administrative mistake that needed correcting. Then his eyes went to the chair at the head of the table. Then to the banking counsel seated along the far side. Then to the compliance director. Then back to me. And then he understood. Not every detail at once, but enough. Enough to know that the institution he thought was shielding him had become the institution exposing him. Enough to know that the delay this morning was not random. Enough to know that his private channels were no longer private. Enough to know that I had not just caught him. I had been ahead of him. He actually laughed once softly in disbelief. It was such a human sound that for a second it almost threw me. Not because it made me sympathetic, but because it reminded me that collapse often sounds smaller than we expect. "What is this?" he asked. His voice was controlled, but there was strain under it now, a pulling tightness. I did not answer immediately. I walked to the head of the table and took my seat. Then I said, "It is the point where your assumptions stopped protecting you." Silence. He looked at the screen again. Then at me. "You bought the bank." It was not a question. "Yes." He inhaled slowly through his nose. The kind of breath a person takes when they are trying to think faster than panic. "This is insane." "No," I said. Stealing from your own company while using a private banking structure you thought nobody would examine closely enough to understand was insane. This is thorough. He turned away from me then, pacing once, one hand at his hip, the other pressed briefly against the edge of the table. A lesser liar might have denied everything immediately. He did not. Smart people rarely waste their best energy on denial when they can tell the room is already too complete. They look for angles instead. Interpretive openings. Procedural weaknesses. Emotional leverage. This is not what you think it is. I almost smiled. That line. The oldest refuge of the exposed. Then tell me what it is, I thought. Tell me what 11.4 million arranged through shells and routed through concealed beneficial control is, if not exactly what it appears to be. Out loud, I said, then explain it. He looked at me for a long second, and I watched him make the calculation in real time. Could he accuse others? Partial truth and redirection? Technical justification? Claim temporary movement of funds? Construct some story about undisclosed strategic reserves? He tried the broadest version first. There were structures in place for asset protection and deal flexibility. You know how exposed we were during the expansion phase. Asset protection for whom? I asked. He said nothing. I turned slightly toward the screen and nodded once. The compliance director advanced to the next set of records. Signature chains. Entity links. Authorization histories. Internal notes from the bank relationship unit. Service escalations. The paper trail he thought was fragmented enough to survive. His face changed with each page. That was the real collapse. Not one big reaction. A series of shrinking possibilities. By the time counsel began outlining the regulatory actions already in motion, he had stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. He was pale now, though still upright. Still trying to hold on to dignity as if posture could preserve what conduct had destroyed. He looked at me once and asked, quietly this time, "How long did you know?" That question did something to me. Because beneath it was the thing he really wanted to know. How long had I sat beside him carrying knowledge he thought would break me? Long enough, I thought. Long enough to see who you were when you believed you had won. Aloud I said, long enough. There are moments when people expect anger and are more unnerved by restraint. I did not yell. I did not list every sleepless night, every layer of damage, every personal and professional humiliation folded into what he did. I did not need to. The room had already become the indictment. Instead, I asked him one question. Was there ever a point where you were going to stop? He blinked, almost surprised. Maybe he expected legal language. Maybe accusation. Maybe moral performance. But that was the only thing I genuinely wanted to hear from him. Not whether he regretted it. Regret after exposure is not truth. I wanted to know whether there had ever been a line inside him independent of fear. A point at which he would have looked at the amount, the damage, the deception, and chosen to end it because it was wrong. He looked away. That was my answer. The handoff after that was procedural. Necessary. Unspectacular in the way real consequences often are. There were no dramatic escorts through crowded lobbies. No shouted accusations. No cameras waiting outside the glass. Those things make good television, but reality has its own colder elegance. Accounts were frozen. Records secured. Authorities briefed. His access across multiple systems terminated. Our attorneys moved on parallel tracks to protect the company, brief the board, and begin the long work of institutional repair. And that is the part people rarely talk about after a betrayal like this. The ending is not the ending. Exposure is only the clean break point in the story. After that comes repair, reconstruction, explanation, shame management, team reassurance, investor containment, legal cleanup, cultural cleanup. The quiet grief of walking into the office and seeing the empty spaces where trust used to sit. The exhausting process of proving to everyone, including yourself, that something built through deception can still be rebuilt through truth. For months after, people kept trying to turn me into one of two women. Either the fool who never saw it coming, or the ice queen who outplayed him. The truth was less flattering and more useful. I was a woman who trusted the wrong person for too long, then learned how to become precise under pressure. That is what I know now that I did not know then. When I started my career, I thought intelligence alone could protect me. I thought competence was a kind of shield. Build carefully enough, work hard enough, stay ethical enough, choose well enough, and surely the people around you would either rise to the standard or reveal themselves early. What I actually learned was this: competence attracts value, and value attracts appetite. Not everybody around a strong structure wants to help build it. Some people only want to understand it well enough to drain it. That does not mean you stop building. It means you stop confusing proximity with loyalty. That lesson cost me millions. But not everything. Because here is the part he never understood. He thought the money was the most valuable thing in the room. It was not. The most valuable thing was the discipline to see clearly once illusion broke. The discipline to not let humiliation make me reckless. The discipline to wait until truth had architecture around it. The discipline to remain emotionally intact enough to act strategically while someone I once trusted moved through the world believing he was invisible. People hear this story and sometimes ask whether I ever loved him. Not romantically. They mean, did I love him in that rarer, more dangerous way business creates between people who build together under pressure? Did I believe in him? Did I admire him? Did I once feel grateful to have him beside me? Yes. That is why the story matters. Nobody is impressed when you outmaneuver a stranger. But when someone who knew your work, your habits, your blind spots, your standards, your hopes for the company, someone who stood in the center of what you built and still chose to hollow it out for private gain, when that person becomes the reason you have to sharpen into something stronger, the story changes. It stops being about revenge. It becomes about reclamation. About taking back authorship over the narrative someone else tried to write using your resources. And no, everything was not suddenly fine after that. This is the part one think matters most, especially for anyone listening who has been betrayed in business, in family, in friendship, in love, by anyone who benefited from your trust while quietly carving out advantages underneath it. Exposure does not instantly restore innocence. Winning does not erase what it cost to get there. For a long time after, I questioned my own perception more than I questioned him. I replayed meetings, emails, jokes, dinners, flights, praise. Every ordinary moment now carrying the sick possibility that it had been layered. I wondered whether I had missed obvious warnings because I wanted partnership more than clarity. I wondered whether I had unconsciously accepted being the operational backbone while letting him become the public face, because some part of me believed that was easier. I wondered how much of the structure that enabled him had been built not just by his deceit, but by my willingness to trust polished competence when it came wrapped in shared ambition. Those are not comfortable questions. But they're better than fantasy. Because fantasy says the story is over once the villain falls. Truth says the story continues in how you rebuild yourself. So I rebuilt. I rebuilt the company first. Internal controls redesigned. Approval structures separated more aggressively. Vendor verification deepened. Reporting pathways strengthened. Cultural signals changed. We became slower in places where speed had once been treated like sophistication. Some people hated that. Good. I learned to stop trying to make everyone comfortable with necessary caution. Growth that cannot survive scrutiny is just delay before scandal. Then I rebuilt my name. Quietly. Not through press. Not through emotional speeches. Through steadiness. Through competent repetition. Through the deeply unglamorous art of showing people, over time, that the institution would hold because I would hold. Investors came back. Staff settled. New leadership emerged. The business did not just survive. It became better structured than before, though less naive. And then, much later, I rebuilt something more private. My trust. Not in others at first. In myself. In my ability to see, to recover, to act without becoming hard in all the wrong places. Because that was the final temptation of this whole thing. Not just rage. Hardness. The kind that masquerades as wisdom. The kind that tells you never to believe, never to partner, never to open, never to share authorship again. But total closure is not discernment. It is fear wearing expensive clothes. I refuse to become that woman. Careful, yes. Watchful, yes. But closed? No. He had already taken enough. There is one detail I have never forgotten from the final day. After most of the room cleared, after counsel and compliance left to finalize the next steps, after it was just the echo of consequence and the stale air of a room where illusion had died, he paused at the door and looked back at me. Not with anger. Not exactly. Something closer to disbelief. As if even then, some part of him could not quite absorb that I had done it. That I had remained silent long enough, clear enough, determined enough to move the whole board under his feet while he was still explaining strategy to me in conference rooms. And in that look I saw the thing that had doomed him from the beginning. He underestimated the kind of woman who does not perform power loudly. He mistook composure for softness. He mistook patience for passivity. He mistook silence for blindness. A lot of people do. And a lot of women pay dearly for being misread that way before the story turns. So let me say this plainly. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself in advance. It does not dominate every room. It does not waste itself trying to look intimidating. It listens. It studies. It absorbs impact without immediately showing fracture. It learns while others posture. It builds while others brag. It waits while others assume waiting means weakness. Then, at the right moment, it moves. If this story is hitting something real for you right now, hit subscribe. I post every day, and I do not want you to miss what comes next. And before I close, there is one last thing I want to leave you with, because a story like this should offer more than satisfaction. It should leave something useful. So here is the educational truth at the center of everything I lived through. In business, there are 3 things you must never outsource completely: oversight, interpretation, and moral courage. Oversight means no relationship is too trusted for structure. If money moves, it must be visible. If systems matter, they must be audited. If a person resists transparency while benefiting from authority, do not romanticize that resistance as genius. Structure exists to protect what emotion cannot. Interpretation means numbers are never just numbers. Learn the story under the spreadsheet. Learn what normal mess looks like in your business so you can identify elegant lies when they appear. Fraud often hides not in chaos, but in over-controlled neatness. In sections nobody questions because they look finished. In confidence that discourages curiosity. And moral courage means this: when truth becomes expensive, you still choose it. Not impulsively, not theatrically, but fully. Because the cost of avoiding truth compounds faster than the cost of facing it. Every day I delayed seeing what was in front of me made him stronger. Every day after I saw it clearly and acted with discipline made me stronger. That is the difference. Not whether betrayal comes. It comes. Not whether people disappoint you. Some will. The difference is what happens after revelation. Do you collapse into noise, or do you become clear? Do you let humiliation write the ending, or do you become deliberate enough to reclaim it? He thought owning access would protect him. He thought complexity would protect him. He thought charm would protect him. He thought my trust would protect him longest of all. In the end, none of those things saved him. Because the one thing he never accounted for was what happens when a quiet woman stops asking for explanation and starts building consequence. And even now, after all of it, after the legal proceedings and the restructuring and the years it took to metabolize what happened, there is still one unresolved question I carry. Not whether he was guilty. I know that answer. Not whether I did the right thing. I know that too. The question I still carry is simpler and stranger. When did he decide? When did the line inside him disappear? Was it one desperate moment that became a second and then a system? Or was I working beside appetite from the beginning, mistaking ambition for loyalty because both wear the same suit in the early years? I do not know. Maybe I never will. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Not every story ends with full understanding. Some end with clarity, consequence, and one unanswered thread you learn to live with. That is what Quiet Storm is. Not revenge. Not noise. Just a woman who understood, quietly and deliberately, what it truly costs to rise. Subscribe. Because there is another storm coming tomorrow.